So we'll begin in just a few moments. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rick Wilson. I'm so happy that you were able to join us for the webinar today. Being a holiday week here in the US, or coming up on a holiday week, it's so nice to see so many attendees at the webinar. We certainly appreciate your time. I'm being joined today by Christina Hill from our marketing team. And Christina will be keeping an eye on the chat window. So if you have any technical issues or questions during the course of the presentation, please try to post them there. And if you do have questions, we will do our best to address those at the end of the session for you. So my title here at Gimmal is Senior Product Manager. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm bestowed with a great amount of experience. I think it's more due to the amount of gray hair that I have. But I have been around for quite a long time. So I started my career in IT well before the personal computer came on the scene. That means I've had the opportunity to see a lot of evolution over the years and work with a large number of clients. And I'm hoping to maybe pass along a few tips and tricks that we've learned during the course of those many years in the IT industry and through this information governance journey as part of the content that we're going to present in the series today. If you aren't necessarily familiar with Gimmal, let me just give you a quick background. We're really excited about the fact that we've been in business over 20 years now, and that's really saying something for a software company. There aren't a lot of them that started 20 years ago that are still thriving today, and Gimmal certainly is. And one of the things that we think sort of differentiates us in the marketplace is we do offer our clients a suite of end-to-end information governance services. That could be anything from managing your records content. Many of you may know us from our electronic or physical records management tools. But we also have a full information governance suite in Gimmal Discover, and we're going to be talking a lot about Gimmal Discover during the course of this series. Adding to that, then, we also have a tool for helping you move from a legacy enterprise content management platform, think Documentum or Content Server, and take that information from those legacy systems over to SharePoint Online. That's our Gimmal Migrate product. And then finally, we have a Gimmal Link. So if your company is an SAP user, especially if you're faced with this S/4HANA kind of a migration, Gimmal Link allows us to help you take some of that existing linkage content that might be in your SAP documents and transfer it to SharePoint as you move content to that environment. So from beginning to end, from records tracking through management of your content, through migration, we have a solution, and we back that all up with an experienced and well-versed professional services staff that can help you through the course of those engagements. We're going to take a little journey over the next 3 weeks, and we're hoping that you'll all be able to join us as part of that. In today's series, I'm going to be covering some why about information governance. We've sort of designed this as the foundation. What can you use in terms of information to go to your leadership and underscore the fact that we really need to get moving on information governance if we aren't already? In next week's episode or installment of the webinar, we're going to be showing you how to use some of the Gimmal tools, specifically Gimmal Discover, to be able to enable some of that information governance. to identify and locate sensitive data, to maybe perform a ROT analysis, and how that can kind of help get your effort jump started. And then the week after that, on September the 14th, we're excited about the fact that we're going to be able to share some live customer success stories with you. So some of our clients who have already engaged in this journey, and they're in the process of working through an information governance program, we're going to bring some of those stories to light and learn a little bit more about them. So one of the things that I actually love about my job in this role is we have the chance to interact with a lot of industry experts. And recently we had the opportunity to have Nick Inglis come and speak to our team. So many of you may know Nick from his involvement with AIM and ARMA. Nick was an early voice in extolling the benefits of information governance. In fact, I think he started the first information governance trade show event over in Rhode Island in Providence. And he speaks a lot of truth. And I love this quote from Nick. So I lifted this directly from him and give him quote credit. Dropping information, losing information, mismanaging information, making it so that it's unfindable after you've used it one time, all of these things damage business. We have to stop screwing up the data. So if you know Nick, he's a very straightforward guy. He doesn't pull his punches. And it's so true. We have to stop screwing up the data. We have to convince leadership. We have to champion within our organizations the ability that we need to, if we haven't already, start moving towards getting a better handle around controlling our electronic information. And why do we need to do that? Well, there's principally two reasons that that might occur, right? There are threats and there are mandates. So I love this slide. So on the left-hand side, data breaches in the headlines. About probably 3 weeks ago, I pulled this slide deck together. And those companies that you see listed in the data breach headlines on the left-hand side of the slide, at the time, those were the hot stories, right? Discord had just occurred. 760,000 people whose personal information had been exposed in a data breach episode. And you can kind of read down through the headlines there with American Airlines. But since that, let me bring up my cheat sheet here. Since that, in just the last few days, like within the last week, Kroll has announced a data breach. A company called Mom's Meals has disclosed a data breach. And Paramount has disclosed a data breach. That one just launched yesterday, the Paramount data breach. There are people who are actively trying to steal your information. We've got to start treating information as an asset, as an organizational asset that has significant value. Because let's face it, the ransomware people have figured it out. You may have also seen in the headlines that there was a big hospital, healthcare ransomware attack in the last couple of weeks as well. And when that occurs and that information is locked and you can't get it back, your company's in serious jeopardy, not only from an operational point of view, but you're also in jeopardy from a reputational point of view. Now, add to that whole risk of the data breach scenario to the privacy, expansion of privacy mandates that we're all forced to comply with, right? So in just the last couple of weeks, we've had up to 11 states now that have enacted some kind of privacy legislation, with Oregon working on theirs right now. In addition to those state-based privacy and security acts, we've got the federal statutes like GLBA, we've got the Children's Online Protection, and certainly GDPR. If you're doing business in the EU, there's been lots of talk about GDPR, of course, over the last several years. And it's only a matter of time, most of our industry experts believe, until the US implements some kind of a nationwide data privacy legislation that might be similar to what we see as GDPR. Interesting about this whole idea of threats and mandates, right? Some organizations that I've worked with in the past don't necessarily think that they are open to this kind of an attack, because maybe they're a little bit more traditional in terms of their business model. I worked with a company several years ago that manufactured water meters. And those water meter assembly folks who worked on the line putting the meters together, everything that they did from a assembly point of view was powered by the electronic feed that they got for the order. So how many units did the customer order? What were the options that were on those water meters that they had to assemble? How were they to be configured in terms of inputs and outputs so they would snap into whatever the municipality's environment was? You know, they were very adamant about the fact that, hey, we're an assembly plant. We've got a foundry where we cast parts. We've got assembly lines. We design these water meters, but that's not necessarily exposing our content to the risk of data breach or shutting down operations from an operational point of view. But the fact of the matter was, it was, because if that information that fed the assembly lines was not available because of a data breach, or the information had been locked through ransomware, it shut down their operations. So no matter what facet of business you engage in today, you need to convince your leadership or strongly advocate for the fact that we need to implement some kind of information governance. Hopefully you've already taken that step, but if not, definitely we need to get started somewhere. And if you're already started, perhaps it's time to think about accelerating the effort as we move forward. So we see a lot of clients that look at this as kind of a isolated project, right? So we're going to do things like we're going to implement a policy guideline for our employees. And that policy guideline is going to dictate how individuals should use information. But they don't necessarily look at the whole paradigm of information governance from a people, process, and technology point of view. And that's really what we're advocating here, the importance of being able to look at this holistically, not as a single sort of silo within your organization. Hey, if we put a set of rules in place for our people to follow, that's going to solve our problem. It doesn't necessarily work that way. You do need to engage your employees. You need to help them understand, socialize, if you will, the idea behind information governance and why it's important. But then you need to back that up with an integrated process. So there has to be a mandated way for those employees to handle that content moving forward. Part of the effort with the process is ingraining that in your daily operations, and then training your employees on how to implement those mandates that you've put in place for managing electronic information, and then reinforcing those on a regular basis. I know here at Gimmal, annually, we have to go through a computer-based training program on how to handle sensitive information. And during the course of that training, they talk about, hey, what does it look like if people are doing phishing? What if they're trying to do sort of social engineering to get access to a password or a login or an IP address or all those sorts of things? Our team here at Gimmal is fairly well seasoned. Our guys are certainly, neck deep in technology every day with what we do. We understand all those things, but you don't necessarily focus on them on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes you need that reinforcement. You need that reminder that, oh yeah, this is important and we need to pay attention to it. And we need to maybe analyze our email content a little bit more closely before we click on an item. We need to be aware of the fact that somebody who's trying to become chums outside of work and get information about our organization might be undergoing social engineering to try and gain access to our information and so forth. Only then, after you've kind of looked at how we're going to implement this with our people and manage it through a process that those people can then leverage and integrate, can we move into the technology area, where we're actually going to find tools that help us power those initiatives and take it forward. We'll be talking a lot more about that during next week's session, where we move into Gimmal Discover. But what we're encouraging you to do is think about the process holistically. How do we get started? It's okay to fail. And in fact, most of our companies, most of our clients, I would say, do have some kind of a problem during the first time they implement the process. They either overlooked one of these pieces of the puzzle, they haven't socialized it with their employees, their processes weren't adequately explained and documented and enforced. The technology that they selected let that process down or didn't provide the people with the information. Hey, this is not a simple thing to do. That doesn't mean that it's not important, but it does mean that we have to give it a try and we have to kind of think about it holistically and move down the road. One of our clients who's done this fairly successfully is in a professional services organization environment. And because of the nature of their business, their employees interact with a lot of clients, and they handle a lot of client-sensitive data. And as they roll off of an engagement where they've been working with a client and maybe helping them re-engineer a business process or solve a business problem or what have you, this client has implemented a process to scan those users' content areas to make sure that the information that was relevant to the engagement they just worked on has been adequately disposed of. Now, that disposition could be deleting content that wasn't relevant anymore. It could be archiving it to some kind of a future store folder or a SharePoint area where we're going to keep client information in a more secure environment. There's a number of ways that that can happen, but the process is what is important because it gives the people the information to be able to make that decision. It reminds them, in fact, you've rolled off of this engagement, but it's not over yet. We still have to make sure that the content that was generated during the course of that engagement has been adequately managed and disposed of properly. And then to round out the circle here, they've implemented technology that enforces that whole process. So the technology scans storage locations where that information might be resident, maybe an employee's laptop, for example, or maybe it's in their OneDrive site, or maybe it's in their mailbox. So the technology is examining those locations to find that sensitive data content. It's then informing the people through an email feed that that was located. Hey, we scanned your content area. We found these emails for that specific engagement. We found these files perhaps on your laptop that need to be managed or indicated for disposal. The employees can then take that email notification that outlines that content and go to a web portal where they can see those items listed, email 1, email 2, email 3, file 1, file 2, file 3, and they can mark the appropriate disposition level for those items. These emails can be deleted, this file needs to be archived, and so forth. And then the technology then implements the routines to manage that content and take action on however the employee indicated the content should be disposed of. So it's a great example of rounding out the whole process here, being able to make it easy for your people, institute a process that they can adhere to, enforce it all with technology. So one of the things that I wanted to do was make sure that we gave you some ideas, perhaps some tips that you could kind of take away with as you're starting through this process. And I called this information governance by design. And it kind of harkens back to what I just talked to you about. How do we implement a process that's going to be effective, repeatable, and adherable? So make the retention and disposition a normal part of your business. This is important from a standpoint of clearly allowing employees to understand what's expected of them. That goes back to that socialization that we talked about earlier, making sure that as people onboard or as people come into the organization, they have a clear idea of how they're expected to handle company relevant information. And then allowing them the ability to do that from a time and process point of view. Giving users the ability to leverage or engage with those processes without disrupting their normal course of business. So as I explained to you before, with the situation that I described for the client that's doing the sensitive data scanning for their professional services engagement, we're using email as the vehicle there. So clients or employees do not have to have any special training. They're automatically notified via an email when there's something that they need to attend to. And then we're providing them with an easy way to do that through logging into a web portal where they can manage and implement the disposition process. What we found over time is if you make this difficult or you rely on the people to do it on their own without some kind of oversight through a process and technology layer, it doesn't get done. So it becomes very easy for people to bypass your whole intended information governance practice if you don't start to take some of these steps to meet them where they live and make it easy for them to be able to do that. Again, from a standpoint of managing the content, hey, it's very difficult. Many of you know this, especially if you've come from a records management background. It's very difficult to know, unless you're a subject matter expert or you've been ingrained in a particular business unit or department of your organization. It's very difficult to determine what is going to be retained or deleted to manage that disposition. So we need to be able to put that decision-making into the hands of our subject matter experts, so they have the ability to use their knowledge and their background to make those determinations. Maybe they're not final, maybe they're recommendations, and that's okay. So, employee B, do you think this should be deleted or retained? And then somebody can oversight that if that's your process and say, well, I don't think we need to be retaining it, even though you may think so, or let's have a discussion about this. But making sure that that takes place through some kind of a scheduled regular disposition, and then setting milestones to manage that over time is really important. And using a business process to make it simple. This goes back to what I talked about before, surfacing it for your users and allowing them to effortlessly, so to speak, not that anything ever is, but we're all faced with a number of competing priorities as employees in our organization. And the more lightweight and less intrusive you can make this process, the higher your degree of success has been our experience with clients we've worked with in the past. So let's flip the coin here. We talked a little bit about the policy and the process, or the people in the process, on the last slide, and take a look at the technology from just a high-level point of view. One of the things that we see on a regular basis is people underestimate where that information is being stored. We have a lot of repositories available to us today. People are keeping information everywhere from their local machines to network file shares. They're using OneDrive as a file, OneDrive or email as a filing cabinet. It might be in Box or Dropbox or SharePoint. So finding a technology solution that allows you to be able to focus in and examine those content areas where you might be having information is critical. So your technology needs to be able to connect to and manage that content wherever it lives. Step two then would be, once we've connected to it, and now we can scan the employee's OneDrive repository. We can perhaps look at their laptop, whatever's appropriate in your organization based on how you perform your business processes. We need to be able to do that on a repetitive basis. Ideally, that's going to happen by electronically evaluating information and deciding if it's important. So we've got some other clients who do this in a similar kind of a vein. They're scanning user devices for sensitive data based on keywords that might be relevant to a client or an engagement. Maybe it's a pattern, maybe it's an expression. And those kinds of interactive sorts of ways of interrogating the content are important as part of this continuous ID process. Of course, we can't have that conversation today without talking about artificial intelligence. It's hard to pick up any kind of a technical article without seeing some reference to AI and all the wonders that it's going to bring to the table. And that might be true, but we might not quite be there yet. So keep it in your radar. If you have the opportunity to effectively implement some kind of an AI, that's great. But it may or may not be ready for prime time yet in the particular world that you're working in. So step three, search and align. Oftentimes, employees really don't care where the information's at, right? They just need to know that this is the process I need to manage. It doesn't really matter to me if it's an email that has client information or a file that has client information. So you need to make it easy for them to be able to identify that content, irregardless of where it lives. And then we'll sort it out all in the back end. If you tell me this file is a problem and it should be deleted because it has client confidential content, then we'll manage through the technology layer where that information resides. We'll scan your OneDrive repository, we'll look at your laptop, we'll examine your email. It's important to be able to do that sort of behind the scenes, because honestly, I mean, the people that we're working with, that we're expecting these decisions from an employee point of view, are not technical gurus. I mean, so you can't expect them to be proficient in all these storage repositories. And in fact, to be terribly honest about it, you can't really expect them to care about it. We just need to know that's the information that needs to be acted on and managed. And then finally, this transform step is really important from the standpoint of being able to identify and deal with content that doesn't fall into a normal tracking bucket. And we see this all the time. I just described a very structured enforcement process where, client laptop or email stored, they review it and tag it and so forth. What that doesn't address is the fact that there might be 20 years worth of content that's stored on a network file share someplace that also has client confidential information. And those files, those documents were created by an employee who was at the organization 10, 12 years ago, whatever, maybe they're no longer there. And when they walked out the door, those files got abandoned, for want of a better term, in a network file share someplace. And they're still sitting in that environment waiting to be discovered and disposed of. We see this all the time. So we'll talk a lot about this in the next session. It's this whole idea of, sometimes it's called cleaning the closet before you do a migration. We see it a lot with the move to migrate content to perhaps SharePoint Online as a modern records management tool. So keep in mind the fact that there needs to be a way in your process from a technology point of view to identify that information that may not be visible to an employee and deal with it too from an enforcement point of view.
Hey, Rick, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but we're on step 3. We have a question by Tammy. And she goes, what is meant by reduce collaboration in step 3? We encourage collaboration.
Yeah, so Tammy, from a standpoint of talking amongst yourselves, you do want to foster collaboration, but you don't want to make it a requirement, because what it does, what we're trying to point to there is it could set up potentially a barrier to enforcing your process. Because if I can't take action on something without some kind of a buy-in from a manager or some kind of a consult with another partner, it could slow the process down. So that's kind of what we were driving at. Maybe we didn't say it in the best way. So that's the information we have prepared for you today. We are certainly willing to take any questions that you might have available. And as I said, we've got 2 more sessions kind of building on some of the foundational things we talked about today. Next week, I'll be showing you how to take some of the things that we talked about and maybe put them into action through some of the Gimmal products. And then we'll certainly be focusing on how some other customers have successfully been able to do that sort of thing in their environment. Christina, I don't know if you had any other questions that we need to tackle.
I do. Ms. Tammy also asked earlier in the presentation, are we using data and information interchangeably? They seem to be struggling to try and differentiate between the two, and they're realizing that many people are considering the same thing.
Yeah, it's a hard problem, Tammy. There's no question. We are using them interchangeably because we see that a lot in a lot of our client engagements. But you do run into a situation where people are thinking about data from the standpoint of being in a database, right? Is it stored in SQL Server or Oracle or some other database on the back end, DB2, what have you? Those database pieces of content are a lot more difficult to manage. They're a little trickier to connect to in many environments, especially from a information governance point of view. But couple that with the fact that that data is so tightly integrated. So you could maybe scan, for example, a SQL Server database and say, hey, this table has Social Security numbers resident inside it. That's awesome. So now we know that there's Social Security content in this database. Maybe we don't need it to be, but we can't necessarily take action on that content, because if we delete a record from that database, from a particular table, that might break referential integrity. That means that that table is linked to some other table inside your system. So data from a hardcore point of view stored in a database is certainly eligible as an information governance. I would call it not the low-hanging fruit, because most of those database applications have some kind of identification and disposition process built into the application that front ends them. But during the course of this presentation, I certainly was bouncing back and forth between and using those interchangeably.
Right, looks like we've got a few more questions. Bob, if you haven't jumped already, yes, this will be provided to everybody, the recording. We obviously want you guys to use this at your disposal and also bring other people on your team aware to some of this stuff. Chris, let's see. Do Gimmal products work hand in hand with Microsoft Purview for content governance?
Yeah, good question, Chris. We're working that direction. So we haven't completely finished integration with Purview yet. I know for a fact in Gimmal Discover, because I manage the product roadmap, that we have that on our roadmap. Now we do expose some of the properties today. For example, you can look at archive and retention tags on an email that might be set through Purview. But if you're using Purview retention tags, we don't completely have visibility to those yet. We're building that into our product as part of the roadmap. So that becomes a stay tuned. It's a little bit, the answer varies a little bit depending upon the Gimmal product at play, but I can answer definitively for the Gimmal Discover for you.
Awesome. Thumbs up from Chris. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. Yeah. Let's see. What are the skills required as far as data governance team members are concerned?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things to maybe consider there. Strong team building skills, which sounds counterintuitive, right? So we're looking at information and data and we're trying to analyze it and determine, is it relevant or not? But you don't do that in isolation. You're going to have to work with colleagues. And in many cases, what we found in the past with other clients we've worked with is you need to be a champion for this process. So if you're going to sort of push this agenda inside your organization, you need to be able to artfully state the reasons why it's important and why we should invest in it from an organizational point of view. You're going to have to socialize that with upper management. You can look for best friends and maybe the legal department if you're large enough to have a chief legal counsel or chief legal officer. That's a great place to start because some of these arguments are going to resonate with them from a security and privacy point of view. Sometimes chief privacy officers, if you're a little bit smaller than that, and maybe you don't have a privacy officer or a legal department inside in the organization, certainly the CFO or CEO might be the next choice. I mean, they can certainly understand the risks that might be involved. So I would say team building skills to be able to interact with your other co-members of your organization to identify and manage content. And then maybe just a broad brushed understanding of the systems in place at your organization today and what those are used for. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in them, but if you know, for example, that we use Documentum as our enterprise content management, or you know that we've got a migration underfoot to SharePoint Online, which we see a lot of today because people are buying Microsoft 365 subscriptions. And hey, it's part of the product. So you're getting it anyhow. Why continue to pay for some other content management repository if we can use SharePoint Online? Perfectly reasonable. But understanding what those key repositories are and being able to identify them. And in some cases, you can be the hero there because you can be the one that discovers the fact that, hey, we've got a whole department that's using Dropbox. Did anybody know we were using Dropbox? I didn't know we were using Dropbox. So that becomes an exposed point that needs to be managed from a content management area.
It looks like, Ashley, your question got answered, but Rick, just so you know, the question was, does Gimmal offer textual/paper to digital scanning to transition to an all digital environment? Ashley responded to her own question saying, looks like Gimmal Physical is the solution for physical records.
Yeah, physical. So we don't have necessarily a scanning component inside Gimmal Physical today. But once the content's stored in a paper, it's in a box, it's in a repository, a warehouse, a records warehouse, or management repository, we can do things like track that box through RFID inside the organization to help you locate where a particular piece of paper is stored and so forth. So kind of a yes and no there. We can certainly help manage those physical records. I don't think we're doing broad-based conversion of them to electronic format today.
All right, back to ya. By systems in place, are you talking about the technology component or both process and technology?
Yeah, I was talking more about the technology piece, understanding what technology platforms are being used inside your organization, depending upon how large you are, right? There may be pieces of the company that are doing things you're not even aware of. So you may need to, for example, engage with a peer that's in a different office location, perhaps even in a different jurisdiction, maybe they're in the EU, something like that, and find out what kinds of systems they're using as opposed to what you might be using here in the US, that sort of thing. But I was thinking more from the standpoint of a technology point of view. If you can map that, traditionally that's called data mapping, being able to identify the various data repositories and the tools that are used to manage them. Once you have your data map, then you can figure out how that data map integrates to the process to manage whatever that type of content might be.
Awesome. Any other questions in the room? Let's see. Wait for a moment. In the meantime, Rick, do you mind showing them where we'll be bebopping around town?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, Christine, I forgot to click that last mouse button. So this is upcoming.
Yeah,
Coming.
so coming up this year, we're going to be at InfoGov World in San Diego. So if anybody is considering looking into it, please feel free to jot down our promo code GML50 for 50% off registration. That's a huge discount. That registration, I think, is a little over $1,000. And then yours truly, Rick, will also be participating in the Masters Conference in New York City. And Dean Gonzowski will be at the Masters Conference in Atlanta later this year. So if anybody plans to attend or has any questions regarding these events, please reach out to us. We'd love to see you there.
Great. Thanks again for your help today, Christina.
Oh, of course. Great. Well, if there's no further questions, we can
Yeah,
leave.
we hope you all can make it next week and as we continue this journey. Okay, thanks. Have a good day, everybody.